The laughter vanishes, replaced by a stunned silence that stretches across the room. Every student, every curious observer, now sits frozen, their attention no longer on the professor, but on the young man standing at the back of the hall. Barron. Trump doesn't look angry. He doesn't look flustered or rattled. Instead, he is composed, calm, and entirely in control of the moment. The professor blinks, momentarily caught off guard, but quickly regains his smirk. "Oh," he says, his voice dripping with amusement. "Barron Trump, everyone. To what do we owe the pleasure?" A few chuckles ripple through the crowd, but they are uncertain, hesitant. The dynamic of the room has shifted, and no one quite knows what to expect next. Barron exhales, slow and steady, before tilting his head slightly. "I wasn't planning on speaking," he says, his voice carrying effortlessly. "But I figured since I seem to be the subject of today's lesson, I should probably introduce myself." A few murmurs. The professor folds his arms, amused. "By all means," he says, leaning against his desk, inviting the moment. "Tell us, Barron, what do you stand for?" Barron nods, as if considering the question carefully. Then, without breaking eye contact, he replies, "That's an interesting question, Professor, but I have one for you first." The professor arches a brow. "Oh, and what's that?" Barron steps forward slightly, his tone never rising, his demeanor never breaking. "If I wasn't my father's son," he says, pausing just long enough for the weight of his words to settle, "would you still be talking about me?" A ripple moves through the room. The professor's smirk falters, just slightly, but enough for people to notice. The students exchange glances, some leaning forward in their seats. Barron lets the silence hang between them, then tilts his head. "Or do you only judge people by their last name?" The air shifts again, heavier, this time. The professor's confidence, once so effortless, now carries a weight of doubt. Barron doesn't move, doesn't flinch. He simply watches. And for the first time in the entire lecture, the professor is the one left searching for words. The silence stretches just long enough to make the professor shift, a flicker of unease crossing his face. He wasn't expecting this. He had built his entire lecture around assumptions, around easy laughs at the expense of someone who wasn't supposed to be here. But now, that someone was standing before him, challenging not just his words, but the foundation of his argument. The professor forces a chuckle, straightening slightly. "Well," he says, masking his discomfort with a light tone, "when you grow up in the public eye, people are bound to have opinions. That's just how it works." Barron doesn't break his gaze. "Opinions?" he repeats, his voice still, calm, still steady. "Or labels?" A murmur spreads through the room, a subtle shift in energy. The professor opens his mouth, but Barron continues. "You see, that's the thing about people like you," Barron says. "You don't ask questions. You assume. You decide who someone is before they ever get a chance to speak for themselves. And then you build a narrative, because it's easier that way." The professor folds his arms, a small smirk creeping back onto his face. "And what narrative is that?" Barron tilts his head slightly. "That I'm nothing more than my last name. That I haven't struggled, haven't worked, haven't earned anything. That I must be exactly what you expect me to be." The professor shrugs. "That's just public perception." Barron exhales softly, nodding. "Ah, public perception." He takes a slow step forward. "Tell me, Professor, do you believe everything the media tells you? Or do you only believe it when it fits your narrative?" A hush falls over the lecture hall. The students who once laughed at Barron's expense are no longer so sure. Some shift in their seats, watching the professor closely, waiting to see how he responds. The professor scoffs, shaking his head. "I think you're overreacting." Barron nods, his expression unreadable. "Of course," he says, "because when someone like me speaks, it's overreacting. But when people like you speak about me, it's just education?" The professor opens his mouth, but no words come. Because for the first time, he is the one being questioned, and for the first time, he doesn't have an answer. The tension in the lecture hall is no longer subtle. It's thick, pressing against every corner of the room. The students, once passive observers, now sit on the edge of their seats, drawn into the moment unfolding before them. The professor, a man so accustomed to having all the answers, is suddenly the one being examined, his own logic being unraveled before his eyes. Barron remains composed, his posture unwavering. He doesn't rush the moment, doesn't try to force a reaction. He lets the silence stretch, lets the weight of his words sink in. The professor clears his throat, trying to regain control. "Look, Barron," he says, forcing a smile. "You have to understand, when people talk about privilege, it's not personal. It's a discussion about social structures, about the advantages some people are born into." Barron nods slowly, as if considering the words. Then he replies, "You mean like how you have the advantage of standing at the front of this room, deciding who is worthy of respect and who isn't?" The professor's face twitches just slightly. He wasn't expecting that. Barron continues, his voice steady. "You say it's not personal, but when you use someone's name as a punchline, when you reduce their existence to a joke, how exactly is that not personal?" A murmur spreads across the room. Some students nod, others glance at each other, as if realizing for the first time that this lecture was never really about politics. It was about power, about control, about who gets to speak and who gets spoken about. The professor exhales, his confidence slipping. "All right," he says, shifting on his feet. "Then tell me, Barron, what do you stand for?" Barron tilts his head, unfazed. "You see, that's the funny thing," he says. "You didn't ask me that question when you were making jokes about me." The room falls into another deep silence. Barron exhales. People assume they know me, that because I was born into a certain family, I must think a certain way, live a certain way. But let me ask you something, Professor. When was the last time you judged someone for their own actions, instead of the name they were given? The professor doesn't answer, because for the first time in his career, he is the one under scrutiny. And for the first time, he is the one who doesn't know what to say. The professor shifts slightly, his carefully maintained composure slipping just enough for the students to notice. The power dynamic in the room has changed. He is no longer the one leading the conversation. He is no longer in control of the lesson. The lesson is happening to him. Barron watches, waiting, giving the professor a moment to gather himself. But there is no rescue from this, no clever deflection, no easy way out. The professor exhales, sharply, as if choosing his words carefully. "All right, Barron," he says, folding his arms. "You've made your point. But let's not pretend that privilege doesn't exist. You've had opportunities that most people could never dream of." Barron nods, unbothered. "Absolutely," he says without hesitation. "I've had advantages. I've had resources. But let me ask you something. Does that mean I should be ashamed of my existence?" The professor blinks, momentarily caught off guard. "That's not what I..." Barron doesn't let him finish. "Because that's what you're implying," he continues, his voice never rising, never wavering. "You're saying that because of where I was born, I shouldn't be allowed to have thoughts, opinions, a voice. That no matter what I do, no matter what I accomplish, people like you will always look at me and see only one thing." He pauses, letting the weight of his words settle. "My last name." The students are completely still now, the air thick with something unspoken. A realization, a shift in perspective. Barron exhales slowly. "You assume I haven't struggled, that I haven't had to work for anything. But let me tell you something, Professor. Being underestimated is its own kind of burden." A flicker of something unreadable crosses the professor's face. Barron tilts his head slightly. "You've spent this entire lecture talking about me without ever knowing me. So tell me, Professor, if that's not privilege, what is?" The professor looks down for a brief moment, as if trying to formulate a response. But he doesn't have one. Because for the first time in his career, he isn't the one teaching. He is the one learning. The silence in the lecture hall feels heavier now, not awkward, but loaded with realization. The professor, so used to being the one in control, the one delivering lessons, now finds himself at the receiving end of one. The students, once eager to laugh along, are no longer sure what to think. They aren't just watching an argument, they are watching a shift, an unraveling of something they had taken for granted. Barron stands steady, waiting, giving the professor space to respond. But the response doesn't come, not immediately. The professor exhales, his confidence shaken, his carefully constructed intellectual walls beginning to crack. He shifts, as if trying to find a foothold, some way to steer the conversation back to safer ground. Finally, he clears his throat. "All right," he says, his voice measured, controlled. "You've made your argument, Barron. But let's not ignore reality. People judge based on what they see. They always have. That's just how the world works." Barron nods, his expression unreadable. "I know," he says simply. "And that's exactly the problem." The professor exhales, a flash of frustration crossing his face. "You're acting like you're the only one who has ever been judged unfairly." Barron shakes his head. "Not at all," he says. "I'm saying that if someone with my privilege can be judged this easily, imagine how many others are dismissed before they even get a chance to speak." A murmur ripples through the room. The shift is undeniable now. Barron continues, his voice calm but cutting. "You talk about privilege like it's a guarantee. But tell me, Professor, how many people have been denied opportunities not because they had too much privilege, but because someone assumed they weren't worthy? How many students have you overlooked because they didn't fit the image of what success looks like to you?" The professor stiffens slightly. He doesn't answer. He doesn't need to. Barron exhales, his tone now quieter, more reflective. "You say this is just how the world works, but you're an educator. Isn't it your job to change how the world works?" The weight of the question hangs in the air. For the first time, the professor doesn't just look at Barron as a trump, as a name. He sees him as something else, as someone who just made him think.